Welcome to Oklahoma Conference Churches. We have a great program tonight. The title of our program is Climate Chaos or Beloved Ecological Community. And I am so thankful to have an expert here with us tonight. A good friend of mine that I've known for quite some time who does great work at Oklahoma City University, Dr. Mark Davies. He's been a professor there, administrator, and leader at Oklahoma City University for 24 years. That's just the tip of the iceberg. With a PhD in social ethics from Boston University, Mark has also served in a multitude of capacities through the United Methodist Church to implement initiatives and bring awareness to causes of global ethics and interfaith higher education with an emphasis on social and ecological responsibility. Mark engages in advocacy and activism in the area of peace, social justice, and ecological sustainability. Locally, this is expressed through his work with the Human Community Network, and I'm sure Mark's going to talk a little bit about that, to create nonviolent systemic change for a just, flourishing human and ecological community. He and his wife, Kristen, and their two teenage daughters reside in Edmond, Oklahoma. Mark, welcome to the program, Dr. Davies, and thank you so much for being here with us.
It's good to be here. Thank you for that introduction, Michael. I appreciate it. And it's almost 25 years now at OCU. And my two teenage daughters are almost no longer teenagers. So time is flying. Time is flying.
So great. You're going to kind of share with us. We're talking about Earth Day. And so I'm just going to turn it over to you, and really looking forward to your words. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm working a little bit this evening with the thought of Martin Luther King Jr. And relating some of his methods for social change to what we might be thinking about and doing in relation to the climate crisis that we're facing. So the title of my presentation this evening is working with the title of a book that was written by Martin Luther King Jr. It was one of his most powerful books. It was written in 1967 and titled, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? So the presentation is Where Do We Go From Here? Climate Chaos or Beloved Ecological Community? In the book that King wrote in 1967, he was reflecting on the profound sense of disappointment in the lack of progress for civil rights that had occurred in the 1960s after the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, which were passed in 1964 and 1965, respectively. By 1967, the Vietnam War had stalled progress on LBJ's Great Society program and the war on poverty that was supposed to be a part of that Great Society program. And the war in Vietnam was also affecting, in a negative way, people of color in a disproportionate way compared to other persons within our society. And to complicate matters even more for Dr. King during this time, some of the civil rights leaders were actively questioning King's nonviolent approach for social change. And some were even questioning whether he was still the right leader for the times. So when he was working on this book, it was a time of disappointment. It was a time of reflection. It was a time of strategically looking forward, asking the question, where are we? And now where do we go from here? Chaos or community? He was strategically reflecting on the next phase of the civil rights movement. And he recognized that to do that well, it was important to take stock of where things stood for the civil rights struggle. He understood that with all progress, there will be some backlash. there will be challenges. Some of those challenges are foreseen, and some of those challenges are unforeseen. King knew that it was vital to the civil rights movement to keep asking the question, where are we going? Where are we going? If the movement was going to remain strong and effective in bringing about systemic change for social and economic justice through nonviolent direct action. And King also knew that it was important to keep a bold vision before the people, a vision of us all living together in peace, understanding, and reconciliation in the one world house in which he said we all have to strive to live together and move towards what King called the beloved community. A vision of us all working together against the triple evils that he identified of racism, poverty, and militarism. King's work on the Poor People's Campaign, with its focus on social and economic justice for all persons, that would have led to another march on Washington in 1968, was also a key part of the new direction for the movement, for the civil rights movement. But as we know, an assassin's bullet brought King's life to a tragic end before he could lead the Poor People's March on Washington. Fortunately, the vision of the Poor People's Campaign lives on, and we see that in the work of Dr. Barber today. If King had lived a little bit longer, I believe that he would have added a fourth evil to the triple evils that I mentioned a moment ago. And that fourth evil would be environmental destruction, in addition to racism, poverty, and militarism, and a number of other evils of social injustice. The importance of taking care of the environment was already implicit in King's World House vision. It was already present in his thinking, just not necessarily in an explicit way. And in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we know that there were a number of successes in relation to protecting this great world house of our ecological community, of which we were all a part. So today, as we're reflecting on another great movement of our time, the environmental movement here during Earth Week, we also have reasons similar to King. We have reasons for profound disappointment in the lack of progress that has been made in the environmental movement. And it is important to ask similar questions to what King was asking about the civil rights movement in 1967. Where are we? How did we get here? And where do we go from here? Climate chaos or beloved ecological community? Looking back on the first Earth Day, which is now almost 51 years ago, I'm 54, so almost all of my life. On that first Earth Day in 1970, it is estimated that 20 million people in the United States took to the streets to protest what the Industrial Revolution had done to the environment and to call for a new way of living on our planet, which is our only home. That first Earth Day is often seen as the birth of the modern environmental movement. And a few months later, in December of 1970, here in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency was formed. And then the Clean Air Act was passed that same year of 1970. And then just 2 years later, in 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed. And then in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was signed into law. In fact, there was so much positive environmental legislation that was passed and signed into law in the early 1970s that the Nixon administration might be known as the ecological presidency, had it not been for a little incident called Watergate. That first Earth Day, full of so much hope and followed by so many legislative successes, could have been and should have been the beginning of an environmental reformation of our human society. It could have been, and it should have been, that moment of national and global repentance from our ways of environmental destruction. And it should have led to a transformation of our social, economic, and political systems to foster a new, sustainable way of relating to the world. After the Clean Air Act was passed, our skies did become less smoggy. After the Clean Water Act was passed, the days of rivers literally catching on fire because of how much pollution was in them, those days were behind us. And after the Endangered Species Act was passed, critical habitat for endangered wildlife was now protected by law. With these successes, the environmental movement was poised to address other critical environmental concerns like deforestation and overconsumption of resources that stress the carrying capacity of the planet. And in the late 1980s, the environmental movement began to mobilize to address the global threat of climate change. Amazing string of successes for this environmental movement, which begs the question, what happened? What went wrong? What went wrong? Why have we lost over 50% of wildlife in numbers, not numbers of species, but 50% in numbers of wild animals have been lost since that first Earth Day nearly 51 years ago? Why have extinction rates increased to the point where species are becoming extinct at least, very conservative estimate, at least 100 times faster than they would have without human activity? Why are we slashing and burning down rainforests? Why have we weakened our clean air and clean water standards? For many years, why have we been rolling back environmental regulations across the board for industrial activity? Why have we ignored climate change for so long that it has become a climate crisis that is now well on the way to climate chaos? Why have so much from the critical work of ecological responsibility? And why are so many persons who identify as Christians often supportive of policies and persons that are so damaging to the environment? One simple answer to these questions of what went wrong relates to something that we've been warned about in many religious traditions, and that is the love of money. Unfortunately, even though some significant progress was made in the years following that first Earth Day 51 years ago, it was also the case that many industrial interests pushed back against the new environmental regulations and sought to diminish the environmental movement and its accomplishments. Like the civil rights movement, the progress of the environmental movement led to a backlash. Unfortunately, there were literally trillions of dollars to be made from industries and activities that are detrimental to the well-being of the natural world. And when there are trillions of dollars to be made, you can rest assured that many persons will organize and do all within their power to get their piece of the multi-trillion-dollar pie. Under the banner of freedom, free enterprise, and capitalism, and often mixed with Christian language and Christian symbols, there has been a very effective movement to undermine the responsible care of the environment over the past 51 years. Billions of dollars have been spent to push back and lobby against the environmental movement, against environmental legislation, and against environmental regulations to ensure that industries could continue to pursue activities that give them their piece of the multi-trillion-dollar pie. The result has been continued extinction of wildlife, continued deforestation, continued environmental deregulation, and continued climate change, hurling us towards climate chaos. Our situation is simply unsustainable for people and for much of the rest of life on the planet. And if our ecological crisis were not bad enough, we continue to face a global pandemic, which makes it difficult to even think about the ecological challenges that we're currently facing. In the middle of a global pandemic, it is more than understandable that we long for things to get back to normal. Normal is not this, and almost anything is better than this. But if all we do is get back to normal, are we really getting where we need to be? Isn't it the case that normal is both unjust and unsustainable? Normal is what has created the crisis that our human community and ecological community are now facing. I don't want to get back to the normal of environmental racism, medical bankruptcies, and employer-based healthcare that can be lost as fast as the spread of a pandemic. I don't want to get back to the normal of extreme income inequality, unequal access to healthcare and education that perpetuates generational poverty, and a criminal justice system that enslaves people of color behind walls of systemic injustice. I don't want to get back to the normal in which essential workers are paid unlivable wages and forced to work 2 or 3 jobs to avoid living on the streets. I don't want to get back to the normal of growing white nationalism, family separations, kids in cages, exploitation of migrant workers, and walls of racism. I don't want to get back to the normal of unsustainable overconsumption, torture chambers of concentrated animal feed operations, and climate crisis denial, hurling us towards climate chaos that threatens so much life on Earth. If normal is all that we can get back to as we work through this pandemic, then we simply perpetuate a world in which the most vulnerable among us and the planet itself will continue to suffer. And we miss the opportunity to bring regeneration to our human and ecological communities. The systems and structures that make so many people of color and other persons who don't have adequate access to economic opportunity and quality health care to be much more vulnerable to this virus must be transformed if there is to be anything approaching resurrection from these days of death. I don't want to get back to the normal that perpetuates the open and festering wound of systemic inequality and injustice in our communities. I don't want to get back to the normal of continuing the 6th great extinction on our planet, and the only one that's been caused by one species. I don't want to get back to the normal of creating an unlivable climate for generations to come. I don't want to get back to the normal of losing another 50% of wildlife over the next 50 years. I don't want to get back to the normal of allowing corporations to make trillions of dollars off of the devastation of our planet. Perhaps now, 51 years after that first Earth Day, we can begin to see clearly that wanting to get back to that kind of normal should not be accepted as being normal. As members of all humanity, perhaps we can all agree that what has been considered normal has not shown the love that we are called to have for our neighbors, nor has it shown the love we are called to have in the beloved community. I pray that we will not simply get back to normal, but that we might find the courage and the creativity to bring a new day of jubilee and justice for both people and the planet as a whole, as we make our journey together to the beloved ecological community. Amen.
Well, that was a lecture and a sermon, and it was extremely informative. So much was going through my mind when I was listening to you talk, Doc, and I was thinking about Flint, Michigan, and the water crisis there, and especially I think it's profound how you brought Dr. King into this, and I truly believe, as you have clearly spoken, that King was aware of this. This was a concern of his, and clearly he would have also moved in this direction. But with the pandemic, and you've talked about that, so I just wanted to just have a few follow-up questions.
Sure.
When with the pandemic that's going on, what would you say the state of the environmental movement is at this point? And I guess taking into consideration, I think we all can agree over the last 4 years prior to the new administration, we had definitely a lack of, I think, interest in the environment. So taking out the Paris Accord agreement and so forth. So, what is the state today of the environmental movement?
I think the environmental movement is as strong today as it ever has been. And I think in some ways, the pandemic has shown us more clearly the problems with our systems, that our systems are not as resilient and just as perhaps many of us thought they were. And that we're going to need to think about ways to move forward that are more sustainable and more resilient. And that includes the way that we relate to the environment around us. And I think that during this time, there's been an opportunity for a lot of people within the environmental movement to reflect on that and to become even more committed to the kind of systemic transformation that's going to be needed to move us in a more positive way. And one of the reasons I think that the environmental movement is as strong as it's ever been is the numbers of young people who are involved in it, who are passionate about it and informed about it, educated about it, are articulate about the challenges that we're facing, and are energized to do something to bring systemic transformation. There's so many movements. I don't want to begin naming them because I'm sure I'll miss a few, but there's so many movements that involve young people, and they're not going to take no for an answer. They may take criticism. They're open to hearing other points of view, but they know the severity of the situation we're facing, and they know that their future, when they look at their lives and they're in their teens or in their 20s, and they look at where we're headed 50 or 60 years from now, and they're looking at their lives as older persons with their children and their grandchildren, they know we can't continue to go down this path because it will be one of really great suffering for them and their children and grandchildren, and for all society. So I'm energized and hopeful. I'm realistic. But I'm energized and hopeful because of that commitment. But here's one thing I would add to that. Those of us who are older, we can't just put it all on the shoulders of the young people. We are the ones who are most responsible for where we are now, and generations before us as well. But we have to be a part of this movement. We have to re-energize ourselves. It has to be a multi-intergenerational movement for us to have the success we need.
And I'm glad you segued great into my next question when you talk about us, the people of faith and we can broaden that out, but our conversation happens to be with the Oklahoma Conference of Churches, so we want to we want to keep that scope. So, what can faith communities do?
Well, I think one of the things that we can do is we have, many of us, tremendous networks. We have tremendous connections. Our faith communities are not only our local congregations. We connect with, our denominational networks. We connect with our ecumenical networks. The church is a global movement. The environmental movement has to be a global movement. So we understand what it means to be a global movement. And we also understand what it means to value and care for God's very good creation. It's one of our core values as persons of faith. I mean, creation is the activity and creativity of God. And by loving God, we also must love creation. And creation is where our neighbors are as well. So by loving creation, we're loving our neighbors as well. So it's part of the core of our faith, the core of our theology, and we have experience in galvanizing and energizing movements for social justice in the past, and we can be of great benefit to this movement for environmental justice in the present and the future.
And I have one more question. I think, and you brought this out, environmental racism.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people do not understand what that is. Could you clarify what environmental racism is?
Well, first, I would just say if someone wants to learn more about it, I would recommend looking at the work of Robert Bullard, who's the founder of the environmental racism movement. But it's a realization that the greatest negative environmental impacts are being experienced by persons of color, both here in the United States and around the world. And so we have a situation where there's tremendous disparities in the impact on persons of color compared to the rest of our communities. And so Flint, Michigan is an example of that. If you look at the most polluted areas in the United States, and also the areas where there are the most health problems related to environmental pollution, they're in communities of color. And so it's a systemic problem. More broadly speaking, you can talk about it as environmental justice, but because it has such a tremendous negative impact on persons of color, I think persons like Bullard have rightly seen it to be environmental racism.
Great. Well, I personally want to thank you for your time tonight, spending a little time with us, talking about this very important issue that I know you've talked about it for so many years, and I hope we're listening. I hope you're seeing that more as you go around and speak, that people are being more receptive to it, and it's encouraging, as you shared with us tonight, that the movement is strong, because that's good. That's really good to hear. So any parting words of wisdom?
Yeah, what you just said there reminded me again of Martin Luther King, and it's something I think that's helpful for us as we move forward. So I said I was hopeful, but I also said I was realistic, and that's something that I see in the work and life of King. King was not a pessimist. King was not a pessimist. He believed things could get better, and he worked extremely hard with so many other people to make them better. But he also wasn't an optimist in the kind of classic sense of that term. He wasn't overly optimistic. He was realistic about the systems of racism that were being faced, the systems of poverty, the systems of militarism. He realized that there was such a thing as too late. That's why he talked about the fierce urgency of now, because there is such a thing as being too late. I often think of King as being not an optimist, not a pessimist, but what one of my professors, who was a mentor of Dr. King, his name was Walter Mulder from Boston University. He said King was a meliorist, meliorist, because he believed that things could get better, but it was going to take hard work and cooperation and real commitment to make things better. And so the future was open, but working together, having faith together in God, and working to bend that, that moral arc of the universe towards justice was something he knew could happen, but he knew it would take work. We had to be involved in the bending of that arc together.
Thank you again, and we appreciate you, and we look forward to having you back to talk more about this beloved ecological community we need to develop. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.